This is my debut episode of what I'm going to call the On the Diamond podcast, as we're going to look at the 2024 MLB playoff picture as it stands right now. What started with 12 is now down to 8. We're down to the Cleveland. Whoop. I hate when this happens. We're down to the Detroit Tigers, the Cleveland Guardians, the Kansas City Royals, the New York Yankees, the New York Mets, the Philadelphia Phillies, the San Diego Padres, and the Los Angeles Dodgers. Let's run down the teams that first failed to get to this point. And what better team to kick it off with than a team I hate with a rage-filled passion, the Atlanta Braves. Going into this year, a lot of people had them docked to win the East Division for a seventh consecutive year. But what got in the way? Injuries. A lot of key players were lost for the season. Spencer Strider to UCL damage. Ronald Acuna Jr. to blowing out his ACL in his other leg. Austin Riley, broken hand. Chris Sale, back spasms at the end of the season. And various other injuries plagued the Atlanta Braves. I mean, so much so they had to play a doubleheader just to get in and split it with the New York Mets. I mean, going into this year, it was foregone conclusion to me that the Braves were going to pull the horseshoe out of their ass, win the division crown, and then crash and burn the divisional title, and then crash and burn during the divisional title series, divisional matchup at worst, and the league championship series at best. But no, they limp their way into the playoffs and basically get swept by San Diego. Oh, and they're hard hitters. I mean, they're heavy hitters. Machado, Profar, Tatis Jr., Higashioka, and various others. This was a team who had the horseshoe ripped completely out of their ass this year. And I did not see it coming. No fucking joke. Next up, the Houston Astros. I think a team every New York resident, past or present, has come to despise over the last decade. And you know who did them in? The manager they threw under the bus and cast as the scapegoat for one of the most notorious cheating scandals in the history of baseball, A.J. Hinch. Talk about comic irony. And I mean comic irony. I mean, then again, we were faced with a rather unfamiliar situation. Since 2017, Houston had either come into the playoffs as the top or number 2 seed in the playoffs. This was the first time they didn't have a say in the bye week. And sure enough, this unfamiliar territory against a manager familiar to their play style did them in. The Gritty Tigs showed their grit and ended the Astros. So, Yankees fans, you don't have to deal with your playoff boogeyman this year. And I know my podcast partner, when it comes to wrestling, is happy for that. My prognostication is happy for that. The succubus made you pay, West champs. Now, whether or not there was another catch to the 22 title, I don't know. But at least Dusty Baker can say he rode off into the sunset last year with his title ring, and he won't suffer any consequences for it. Next up, the Baltimore Orioles. Talk about hitting rock bottom. I mean, don't get me wrong. Everyone knew that the series between the Royals and the Orioles was going to come down to defense, and pitching. Who had the better pitching? And unfortunately, with the bats going cold for the Orioles throughout most of September, it basically went the way of Kansas City. A team who hadn't been back here since they won it all back in 2015. Who many would say by sheer dumb luck and being one of the major benefactors of a Twins collapse. But that said, Kansas City's pitching constantly threw Oriole hitters off balance. The only one who was actually getting hits off Kansas City pitching was Cedric Mullins, from what I remember. And even he was basically forced to carry the team on his back offensively. Baltimore is going to need to restructure their hitting core in 25 as well as their bullpen. At least that's how I'm looking at it. Talk about a bit of taking a step backward from last year. But then again, they didn't do all that well last year either. And they were the top team in the American League last year in terms of record, and they got swept by Texas. A World Series champion who only won 2, count them 2, home games all postseason. Game 3 against Baltimore and Game 1 against Arizona in the World Series. What up with that? What's up with that? Finally, the Milwaukee Brew Crew. Dead are the memes of the Lolmats, and born in their place, the memes of the Bluers, as in Milwaukee blew it. Especially when you consider that on paper, at home, especially since 2016, they had made the New York Mets their quintessential bitch. Had taken all but one series from the Mets in that stretch. And in most of the series they beat the Mets in, swept them. Lone exceptions was when they lost one game in 2016. What was supposed to be the final game of the regular season this year, and losing 2 out of 3 of the Mets in 2022. You know what else would have helped the Brewers? Figuring out how to hit David Peterson. Because if there was one pitcher who was on that Mets rotation that made the Brewers his bitch over the last 2+ years or so, it was him. And I mean, let's look at that final game of that series. Actually, I can't. But let's talk about it. Devin Williams' last pitch of that game. It's 3-1 pitch to Alonso. What does he throw him? A middle out changeup. A cookie that Alonso was able to get a good chunk of the bat on, drive it to right field, and over the wall. And even if he were to jump as high as he could or climb the fence, there's no way Sal Frelick was able to catch that ball. If he catches it, yeah, the Mets lose 2-1 at best. But that was a cripple shot. The Brewers blew the series, and for the second year in a row, underestimated their opposition and get knocked out in the wild card. I mean, when you consider the Brewers had the momentum going in after rallying from 3-1 down in the previous game to win on a gamble that didn't pay off for Carlos Mendoza the previous night. So now, what's Milwaukee to do? Don't get me wrong, Pat Murphy did a good job in his first season as the manager of Milwaukee. But that said, he still needs to get this crew over that hump. This is a team that hasn't made the league championship series at best since 2018. And they lost to a team who had to basically qualify for the playoffs on the final day and hadn't won a postseason series since the league championship of 2015. This is something that may need to be rectified for the Brew Crew. Maybe strengthen the bullpen, get better pitchers in the rotation as old arms are starting to die off. Force Yelich to hang it up because he's kind of a liability if he's not there due to back problems. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do if you're Milwaukee. What you do if you're Milwaukee in this situation. That's as far as I can say. But now we have a new meme. But regardless, new meme. Dead or Lomax and born are the Bluers. Now let's look at the 8 that are going to fight it out starting today. We'll start with the team no one expected to make it, the Detroit Tigers. If you told me that the Tigers were going to make the playoffs with about 6 weeks left and then 10 back of the wild card and 7 or 8 under the 500 mark, I would have laughed at you. But they did make it. Although, again, it took a Twins collapse and them losing a tiebreaker to Kansas City to get there. I had to have a tiebreaker with the Royals to get there, but they fucking made it. This is a team that defines grit. And you're going to have to find some way to bend and break this Tigers lineup. And Cleveland, I'm not sure if they've got the spark plugs to do it. So, how do you go about it? I don't know. I mean, let's face it. While I will credit the Mets for being smart and getting rid of Javi Baez, the Tigers were stupid to pick him up because of his ego and the litany of injuries he's suffered the last few years since joining the team. And basically running on reserves, very few people have heard about, including me, has actually made the Tigers better. But here's their biggest weakness. It's basically down to a two-man rotation of Tanner Skolbeck and Sklubach and one other guy. Let me check their rotation. When you consider most of their major arms that were there at the start of the year are on the shelf. Tyler Holton, Tanner Skubal, Tarek Skubal, I don't know the rest. But the point is, this is a Tigers team that's been over reliant on its grit. And when I say over reliant, I mean over reliant. I mean, listen to the names that are in today's lineup for Detroit. Most of them you'll never have heard of. Parker Meadows, Kerry Carpenter, Matt Vierling, Riley Green, Colt Keith, Spencer Torkelson, Zach McKinstry, Trey Sweeney, and Jake Rogers. Doesn't seem like the team that provides a lot of intimidation, does it? It doesn't sound like a team that's designed to intimidate someone. Nor does their pitcher today, Tyler Holton, who's predominantly a bullpen arm. And when you consider that the Tigers have had to resort to bullpen arms for a good chunk of the year, this is a team that was taken out of the frying pan and thrown instantly into the fire. But let's see if the script writers are merciful to them. The Guardians, on the other hand, this is a team that basically didn't even get to finish their season like Houston because of a washout on the final day. And MLB not having the cojones to have both teams play on Monday to basically give us a little more variety and a bit of a stress reliever from the doubleheader between the Braves and Mets. It's frustrating, but still. For the Guardians, they've been bridesmaids, never brides, has been / never was. This is a team that hasn't made it back to the World Series since 2016, when they lost in dramatic fashion to the Cubs, blowing a 3-1 series lead when they were still called the Indians. Fuck the government for forcing to change the name. For those wondering, yes, I still have that Chief Wahoo Indians hat in my closet. But that said, how things are going to play out, I don't know. But the Guardians need to step up for this one if they're going to make it further than they have before. Kansas City. Like the Tigers, this was a team I would have laughed at if you laughed at you for telling me they were going to make it to the World Series. However, unlike the Tigers, they at least have a rotation that's constantly healthy, as well as player lineups that you are familiar with, and a team that their opposition, the Yankees, are familiar with. Will they get far? Who knows? I don't. I mean, yes, my World Series prediction of Tigers Mets is a bit wacky, but get in the minds of a sports script writer. If all sports are indeed rigged, they're going with the most fairy tale of, and they try to go for the most fairy tale of fairy tale endings. It would make sense if it were Tigers Mets this season in the World Series. Anyway, for the Yankees, to me, this is the combination of Brian Cashman and Aaron Boone's last fucking chance. Now, Boone's Yankees, for the most part, when it comes to just getting to the playoffs, with the exception of last year, they've been a model of consistency. Again, at least getting there, with the exception of last year due to the litany of injuries they suffered. This year, the injuries have been a little less apparent, but there were still some fuck-ups. It went from one of the best teams to a borderline top 5, to the best team in baseball after May, to basically a top 5 at best in June. Due to bad play calling, no discipline at the plate, some injuries, and pitchers blowing shit on the mound. It was a rough time for the Yankees in June and July. They turn around again in August and September and barely win out the division and barely win out the top spot. And unlike the Guardians, they did get to play their final game of the season against Pittsburgh. Anyone who remembers my game call on that one would know what I'm talking about. For the Yankees, it's going to be tough having to deal with 2 possible scrappy contenders and 1 viable threat. Whichever one of them gets into the league championship, they'll more likely earn it. But again, for Cashman and Boone, this is essentially their last chance, in my mind. Fans have been getting, even the most optimistic of Yankee fans, have been getting fed up with this combo for a long time now. Moving over to the National League. Let's start with the Los Angeles Dodgers. And why am I starting with them and not with the New York Mets? Well, the Dodgers probably have the most concerns. And what's their biggest concern? Dave Roberts' overmanaging and pitcher gambling, especially when you consider the Dodgers for the last handful of years have never addressed their critical flaw, the litany of injuries to their bullpen and to their pitching rotation. Why not just go out or delve into the farm system and call somebody up? Why not, Roberts? Because From what I've seen, this pitching core has had problems in the postseason. Clayton Kershaw is almost never healthy. Most of the guys that helped you in 22, like Tony Gonsolin, been under the knife and have been stuck there for the better part of a year plus, and are not set to return until next season. Walker Buehler's been horrible. You only recently got Jordan Yamamoto back. Yoshinobu/Jordan Yamamoto back. Ohtani, the guy you wanted for pitching, has spent the entire year as a DH because of UCL damage in his pitching elbow. So instead of taking the whole year off to get Tommy John surgery, and he gets surgery, or maybe even if he did, and he figured I'd just be a DH and just swing the bat. Let me check some. Eesh. So September 23 for his pitching elbow, he had his third Tommy Johns. Jiminy Cricket. Tommy John, Jiminy Cricket. I mean, don't get me wrong. Shohei played out of his fucking mind in the back end of the year to become the first 50-50 player. 50 homers, 50 stolen bags. MVP candidate, I won't doubt it. But even those accolades may not be enough if San Diego shuts him down. Sure, the Padres won't be without one of their best pitchers in these sorts of situations, Joe Musgrove. They're going to put Dylan Cease on the mound tonight. But it's not going to be an easy matchup for the Dodgers. This is a San Diego is a team that, to me, can go tit for tat with the bats and do just as much, if not more so, with their rotation. But how will it play out? Who knows? Speaking of the Friars, last year, this team got basically wrecked by injuries. Simple as that. And why they basically St. Louis and the Mets, shit the bed last year. And got knocked out of the playoff hunt pretty early. It was prepping to be the same thing for the Padres again this year until after Father's Day against the Mets, where they got swept, they started to turn around. And they just kept winning. And after the All-Star break, they just kept winning and winning and winning and winning. It seemed like nobody could stop them. And even when you could stop them and get them on a small losing streak, the relief was brief because the bats just kept whacking and whacking and whacking and whacking. How do you stop that? Whew. It's not going to be an easy matchup. And when you consider that the NLDSs are both division rivalry matchups, neither are going to be pretty. Now let's move over to the other one. We'll start with the NL Eastern Division champions, the Philadelphia Phillies, who between them and the Braves, I say are the lesser of two evils to hold that title of the Met division crown if the Mets don't get it. I mean, when you've dealt with 6 years of the Braves somehow pulling the horse, getting that horse, having that horseshoe up their ass, and winning the division crown year after year, it's a nightmare. The Phillies this year, they started off like the Yankees, red fucking hot, dominant. Bell go dong, long bomb after long bomb after long bomb, and the bullpen, which had been one of their biggest weaknesses over the years, has become one of their biggest assets. The rotation, on the other hand, has slacked a bit. Sure, Zach Wheeler, Aaron Nola, and Christopher Sanchez have been still lights out for the most part, but Ranger Suarez's back issues have been coming back to haunt him, and Taijuan Walker was nothing but dog shit, throwing cookie after cookie after cookie. And at first glance at the start of the season against the Mets, it looked like they dominate them. But after the London series give each team 3 months off from facing each other, the Mets end up taking 4 of the final 7 from Philadelphia. I mean, especially with how bad coming out of the chute in the second half Philadelphia was, and especially in September. I mean, it's been a bit of a down year for the Phillies. It took Bryce Harper over a month to break his home run drought. Trey Turner has been iffy by his ridiculous standards as a hitter, but then again, when you spend at least a couple of months on the shelf, it's bound to happen. It's so ridiculous. I mean, the fact that the Mets were able to stave off Philadelphia from winning the division crown in Citi Field that whole weekend series, only losing to the Phillies once, was a shocker. Or for me. If the Phillies don't fix their issues soon, they actually may get knocked out in this round as opposed to the league championship. I know they're fueled for a red October. The past 2 years, they've either made it to the World Series and got knocked out, or made it to the league championship series and let it slip away. The latter was especially embarrassing to Arizona last year for them. And now, let's look at the team who they're facing. The New York Baseball Mets. When this team started the year, and Carlos Mendoza was making if there was one character flaw the Mets have, it's Carlos Mendoza's compulsive pitcher gambling habit. Whether it be with the rotation, the bullpen, or both. Early games, it seemed like his gambling habit presided in the bullpen, especially in games where the Mets should have won but lost because of a bad judgment call on Mendoza's part to go to the wrong pitcher at the wrong time. Most of these came in April through May especially. Not that anyone knew that Diaz was dealing with a shoulder issue, which led to the rest of the bullpen getting overtaxed. Throwing the bats weren't being up to snuff in most cases. Brett Beatty proving to be a dud, had to call up Mark Vientos, who proved to be a much bigger boon. Cutting Omar Narvaez, who was not as advertised. I don't understand why Billy ever called him up. Francisco Alvarez spending a month on the shelf with a thumb sprain. Almost 2 months on the shelf with a thumb sprain. No Kodai Senga due to a shoulder issue, and then later a calf strain. Losing Jeff McNeil to a broken hand. So while the Mets Though that moment wasn't until much later in the year. So what do the Mets do? They call up Jose Iglesias from the minors, who was at the tail end of it, who thought his baseball career was over, and switched to an L-pop career, or Latin pop music, for those wondering what I meant by L-pop. And used a new single he was going to debut entitled OMG as his walk-up song. The team liked it. He introduced it to the crowd, and they loved it. Then Lindor called a team meeting against LA. Well, the Mets got swept, and Yordan Lopez called the team the worst effing team in the league. They start going on a little run, have a few bumps and curves, and then comes June 12th, where one moment turns the tide. Grimace. Yes, the fucking McDonald's mascot throwing out a first pitch, and the Mets go on a roll, winning 60 of their final 94. Their final 87 at that point. Their final 86 at that point. Of their final 85 at that point or so. Multiple streaks of 7 in a row, including one of 9 in a row. The gambling reduced to a minimum by Mendoza, though he does gamble a good bit in August, where I wanted to strangle him to death. And yet, on the final day of the season, the Mets sneak into the playoffs with an A973 record. And then they get a miracle in the division, in the wild card round, to beat Milwaukee. Now they face Philadelphia today. Kodai Senga goes on the mound, and I don't know what to think of this. This sounds like another gamble because it's an even playing field. On the one hand, yes, last year, Senga made Philadelphia his quintessential bitch. They couldn't figure out how to hit him all that much. But on the flip side of that coin, Philadelphia hasn't pitched bad against him at all. So it's basically a fresh meat situation. Especially when you consider Senga has only been on the mound once all season. 5 1/3, 1 run on a walk, 9 strikeouts against Atlanta, and 3 hits against Atlanta where he blew his calf out. So how is this going to play out? I don't know. But I am hoping the Mets win this series. But we'll see how things go from here on out. That's it for today's debut episode of the On the Diamond podcast. Like and subscribe. Also, subscribe to not just myself, Mets 212, and the Big Blue Crew Sports Network. Also, subscribe to the other content creators of the crew. Classified 4 with Joel. G Nation Inside Sports, Unpopular Opinion, Man Cave Podcast, Coach Eddie, El Capitan, Big Pat, Zion Zenith, Wales to New Jersey. Miz, and the rest of the Big Blue Crew. Goodbye and good night. Bang.